Welcome to the Hashimoto's Doctor podcast. You're now part of a growing community of people determined to take their health back through education and self-empowerment. But because of the healthcare system today, we don't have access to the types of healthcare that we want. So we have to do things differently. We've got to do things smarter, and we do that by becoming our own advocates. This podcast will give you the perspective and thoughts of one of the world's leading Hashimoto's doctors. So let's get started. Hi everyone, Dr. Shook here. I hope you're doing well today. In today's podcast, I want to talk to you about, I want to continue our thoughts and discussion on gluten, autoimmune diseases, especially celiac disease, which is a full-blown immune response to gluten that causes destruction of the small intestinal lining and creates a lot of major problems for our health. And that gluten, celiac, autoimmune connection, and in particular, let's talk about autoimmune thyroid disease. Now, autoimmune thyroid disease, there are several different types, but primarily we think of Hashimoto's thyroiditis and Graves' disease as the most common autoimmune thyroid conditions. And the reason I say many is because there are a lot of different tissues that could be attacked by the immune system that are responsible for thyroid hormone physiology. There are different enzymes and proteins and hormones that can be attacked. Those things, we don't technically have names for a lot of those types of autoimmune processes, and that's why I say the most common things what we think of and what we look at clinically are Hashimoto's and also Graves' disease. So when we are looking at and considering these things, we want to talk about, what I really want to focus on is this relationship to autoimmune thyroid disease, in particular Hashimoto's and Graves' disease, but primarily Hashimoto's because the majority of the people that have autoimmune thyroid conditions have Hashimoto's. So let's talk about what are the most common autoimmune diseases in people that have celiac disease, which we know is a full-blown autoimmune response to gluten, right? So the most commonly found autoimmune diseases are autoimmune thyroid disease, primarily that's going to be Hashimoto's thyroiditis or Hashimoto's, and diabetes mellitus type 1. So this is an autoimmune process against the pancreas, which diminishes and decreases its ability to produce insulin. These people are insulin dependent. Now, a very interesting thing here, and so before I kind of transition into this thought, is let me just restate what I said. Autoimmune thyroid disease, primarily Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and type 1 diabetes are the most commonly found autoimmune diseases in people with celiac disease. Now, celiac disease is a full-blown autoimmune response to gluten, right? It causes destruction of the small intestine, the lining of the small intestine, and creates a ton of different issues. There's a higher incidence rate of autoimmunity amongst people with celiac disease, and we don't know for sure the exact mechanism. I've talked about this in some of my previous podcasts, but we know that it damages the intestinal lining, which is one of our barrier systems that's incredibly important at allowing us to have immune system tolerance. So it's really important that we understand that. So with that being said, the most common autoimmune diseases in those people with celiac disease are autoimmune thyroiditis, primarily Hashimoto's, and type 1 diabetes. Now, this is a really important thing to understand here, because a lot of people think, well, type 1 diabetes, doesn't that happen when someone's really young, like to babies or to very young children where they become insulin dependent and have to be on insulin for their, the rest of their life? Yes, that's when we most commonly see it. But did you know that there are 5 different types of diabetes? Did you know that? There are 5 different types of diabetes, and this can happen later in life. And as a matter of fact, it happens a lot more frequently than you might think. So let's go through the 5 types of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is what we're talking about. We typically see that in infancy, very early childhood, where the child becomes insulin dependent due to an immune response against their pancreas, and they cannot produce insulin. Okay, it's type 1. Type 2 is what we classically think of as diabetes of adulthood. This is the typical person's going to be obese. They're going to have insulin resistance. They're going to have high lipids, high cholesterol, typically high triglycerides, high blood sugar. Over over 127, they're going to have a hemoglobin A1C of over 6.4. You're going to see a lot of these signs and symptoms. That's the classic type 2 diabetic, right? That's what we have an explosion of in this country. But there's something very important about this population of people, which I'll get to in just a second, okay? There's type 3 diabetes, which is one of the sub-classifications of Alzheimer's disease. Yeah, you heard that right. So Alzheimer's disease, a neurodegenerative or brain degenerative condition, there are researchers that are subclassifying it to different causes of Alzheimer's, right? So one of those is type 3 diabetes, loss of glucose regulation within the brain. There are other proposed causes, infectious, traumatic, so blunt injuries. There are other mechanisms behind it, but this is a major driving factor to neurodegenerative conditions. So they actually call type 3 diabetes Alzheimer's is being referred to as that throughout the scientific literature. There are hundreds of papers, if not thousands by this point. There is gestational diabetes, so it happens during pregnancy. Those are the 4, and then there's one more. Okay, this is the one that's really important to us. It is type 1.5. Okay, what is type 1.5 diabetes? Type 1.5 diabetes is adult onset type 1. Okay, so remember, type 1 is an autoimmune response against the pancreas. We usually see that when? We usually see that in childhood. We usually see that in infancy, where the immune system attacks the pancreas, destroys the cells that produce insulin, and the person is insulin dependent. But did you know that 20% of type 2 diabetics, estimated that 20% have type 1.5 diabetes? These people look like they have type 2, right? They are obese, they're overweight, they have insulin resistance, they have high lipids typically, high cholesterol levels, high triglycerides. Everything looks like type 2 diabetes. These are the people that are most commonly non-responsive with their diabetes is non-responsive, or it doesn't respond very well. It's not resolved with diet and exercise, right? So they change their diet, they exercise regularly. However, they still have problems with glucose regulation in their blood sugar. So these people are your type 1.5 your type 1.5 diabetics. So it's a blend of autoimmune. So it's adult onset, basically autoimmunity. And there's a spectrum here, because it can be in the early stages where you don't recognize it at all, or it can become after years and years, and it can happen at different rates and different speeds. But typically over time, it gets significantly worse until it's very obvious that we're dealing with type 1.5 diabetes, or what they'll call type 1. When it's full-blown autoimmunity as an adult. So the reason that this is really important for us is because there's expansion of autoimmunity. A lot of people are dealing with type 1.5. It's 20%. So if there, out of every 10 people that have type 2 diabetes, there are going to be 2 of those people that have type 1.5. And I can tell you right now, very, very few people are aware that this even exists, that this is a possibility. And there are a lot of people that are undiagnosed. So, this is really common. Autoimmunity in celiac, people that have celiac disease, autoimmune thyroid conditions are very common, as is type 1 diabetes, and which could also be translated into type 1.5 as an adult, right? So they develop it at adult onset. And this was actually, there was a study done on this. I mean, this is not just, random statistics here. This was associated autoantibodies in celiac disease. This was from 2007. It was a fantastic study that I think really highlights the fact that autoimmune diseases come in groups, and more importantly, we're tying this association to gluten. So you can look at this and you can say, okay, the person has autoimmune thyroid disease, they have diabetes, type 1 diabetes, and they're celiac. And you might say, well, you know what? You might be thinking, well, I'm not celiac, so what does this have to do with me? Well, we're looking at these potential connections to gluten, right? Because a lot of people tend to do better when they remove gluten from their diet if they have any type of thyroid dysfunction whatsoever. And you can go back to my last few podcasts where I discuss this in greater detail, and I explain some of the theoretical mechanisms. We think, we know that with celiac disease, there's massive destruction of the small intestinal lining, which breaks down that barrier system. So your intestinal wall is essentially, it's like your skin. It keeps things outside of the body that shouldn't get into the bloodstream, outside. And if it breaks down, those things can get into the bloodstream, right? So with celiac disease, you have massive destruction of this barrier. And so food proteins and bacterial byproducts like lipopolysaccharides, these byproducts of bacterial cell death or metabolism, leak their way into the bloodstream, trigger an immune response, and that's one of the primary mechanisms that we believe drives autoimmunity. Now, it's really important to understand that if we look at this increased rate of thyroid autoimmunity and pancreatic autoimmunity, and we know that it correlates with people that have celiac disease at a higher rate, we say, well, is it the gluten, maybe the protein structure of the gluten that is mimicking, so it has a similar structure to maybe parts of the pancreas or parts of the thyroid or enzymes in the thyroid, so the immune system can very easily attack those tissues, mistaking them for the gluten? Or is it that by breaking down the barrier system, the intestinal lining, that we create this permeability, this leakiness that allows all of these food proteins and things to leak into the bloodstream and trigger a massive, immune response to various types of proteins that may then trigger an immune response against the tissues of the body. There's all these different proposed mechanisms or theorized mechanisms. There's molecular mimicry, there's the bystander effect, there's all kinds of different immune mechanisms, and we don't know for sure, and the reality is that a lot of these, reasons for our body attacking itself, there are probably multiple mechanisms. It's not as simple as one simple thing, right? And I think as research continues, we'll learn more about that mechanism. But from a clinical perspective, and what do we do? Just if I can't drive this home if I haven't, what am I trying to say here? If I haven't, kind of ad nauseum elaborated on this point, then let me just drive it home one last time. Gluten correlates with and has, very likely connections to autoimmune diseases and to autoimmune thyroid disease. And when we remove it from someone, clinically, we tend to see improvements, even if they don't know if they have Hashimoto's. We see that happen. Now, does it happen in every person? No. Does every person need to avoid gluten? I mean, I say no. And that's debatable. People will say, well, what about the genetic modifications? What about different herbicides and pesticides and things that are sprayed on it? Yeah, I understand that. And I mean, I'm gluten-free, but I do have sensitivities to it. I don't have a genetic predisposition to it. However, I feel much better when I don't consume it. And there are mechanisms that we may not fully understand yet. But I've elaborated in previous podcasts research that will expand on why we think that going gluten-free tends to be helpful to people. And all you need to really understand is that if it's something that you're pondering, if you're having thyroid-related problems, if there's one thing that you might want to try, that's something that you might want to consider, because it has been shown, we see it clinically to be very beneficial. So I just wanted to share that with you, and I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you for hanging out with me, and I look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed hanging out behind the scenes with Dr. Shook. You can also talk with and learn from Dr. Shook through Facebook Live on our Facebook page at the Office of Dr. Brad Shook. Don't forget, you can also get access to our videos, guidebooks, and thyroid programs at www.drbradshook.com. Oh yeah, and don't forget one more thing. We can change the world one person, one family, and one community at a time. Until next time, remember, today is your day, and no one will tell you who you are and what you can be.